Hi everyone, and welcome to Property Development Derisked. And this is a podcast where we talk all things pre-construction in property, and we bring experts in to help you keep your projects on track. So today we have an excellent guest, Mark Baigent. Welcome. Hi, Mark.
Hiya.
Mark is I would say, veteran in the local authority, public sector, direct delivery space, and you've worked for several local authority councils, specifically in London, like Tower Hamlets, Haringey, Kingston, Lewisham, Sutton, Harlow, and now Redbridge. I'm sure I've probably missed a few others there. I'm sure there's plenty more. But essentially, Mark has worked in leadership positions, specifically in property development, kind of development directors and property regeneration, etc. So, Mark, welcome to the podcast.
Thank you very much.
And first thing I wanted to say is, please feel free to expand on your kind of introduction and your background and bio, basically. I know there's loads more companies you've worked with.
Sure. I mean, I actually started out at the front line in housing in a local authority with homeless people. So helping people into temporary accommodation, giving them advice with private landlords and all of the stuff at the really sharp end. And then I gradually moved on into more the strategy and policy end, and then delivering capital programs, whether that was investment in existing council housing or developing new council housing, and working with housing association registered provider partners. So I've done that full range really, and increasingly now working more and more in the wider regeneration area, town centre regeneration, and in my new role in Redbridge, I'm starting to get involved in leisure and culture and other wider aspects, which is really stretching and interesting.
Yeah.
On
outside
top of all
of the
of that.
world, outside of housing.
Absolutely. But I think today we're going to focus on housing, aren't we? So, I mean, most of my work over the last 10 years has been around direct delivery by councils. And for quite a large part of that, it's been focused on local housing companies that councils have set up, but also helping councils make choices between doing something that way or doing something through their own housing revenue account or general fund, or indeed working in a joint venture with a partner. So what I was really going to focus on today was some of those different options.
Yeah, no, excellent. I think that's really interesting, because the rise in local authority, public sector kind of direct delivery is growing. I think me and you were in a session a few months ago, I remember, with lots of housing experts talking about some of the research that came out of the UCLA from Professor Janice Morfitt, and she said that she's done the research and questionnaires over the last 6 years, I believe, and since then she saw that in 2017, 65% of all councils in England were saying that they were kind of involved in development. In 2019, that was 70%, and the latest one that's come out is now 80%. So that's really growing. So you can see that local authorities are really starting to take that on board a lot more. And it'd be great to get your views on those different options for these local authorities, which you're going to talk us through.
Sure.
So excellent. I thought one thing I just want to ask you before we move on to that is, so you had a consultancy. You worked as a consultant advising all these local authorities for how long? Seven or 8 years?
7 years.
Is that right?
Yeah.
Yeah, excellent. And recently I think it's been over a year now since you've moved directly in-house to Redbridge, London Borough Redbridge.
Yeah, it's not a year yet. It's
Okay.
Since the spring 2022, so it's been about 7 or 8 months.
Yeah,
and
excellent.
So I was doing a number of different consultancy roles. Some of that involved interim management, directing departments for councils. So I actually came into Redbridge as an interim corporate director. And I made the decision that for me, I wanted to commit myself to one place and to see through a number of big projects. And as a consultant, I'd started a lot of things off. I'd looked after a lot of things, but I hadn't really done an end-to-end completion. The last time I really did something like that was back in Greenwich Council, where I was working for a long period back in the early noughties. And I was able to see projects through to the end. And I just wanted to get that sense of reward of seeing things through, so that I made that commitment to stay longer term in Redbridge. So I'm now in a permanent role here.
Yeah, excellent. And a lot of people I speak to, I think one of the really exciting things about working in this industry is actually at the end of it being able to point to something and say, yeah, we helped to deliver that library or that development or that school or whatever it might be. So yeah, I completely get that feeling. Awesome. Okay, so Mark, let's say you're a local authority. One of our listeners working at a local authority, and they've got ambitions to try and deliver more housing for their local residents. So talk us through high level. I know you said you told me previously there's 4 key kind of options, and yeah, if you could highlight the 4 options and then we can dive into it.
Sure. So I mean, what I talked about in terms of the 4 key options, obviously there's direct delivery by the local authority. Then there is setting up a direct delivery vehicle like a housing company or an RP that is owned by the council. Then there is doing a joint venture with another partner, whether that's an existing RP or an existing private developer. And then the last one really is just taking the land that the council has and selling it, doing a development agreement with, again, an RP or a private developer. So there's a range of different options, but there's different degrees of control, there's different degrees of ownership, and there's different impacts in terms of finance and in terms of risk taking. So direct delivery, the local authority is holding on to the risk, whereas when you go to a JV, you're sharing the risk, and when you go to a sale development agreement, you're passing that risk over. So from a strategic point of view, there's a number of questions that the local authority has to ask itself as to which of these is the right route to follow. Does the council want to own the end product and have long-term responsibility for it? Does the council want to hold that risk if it doesn't have experience in development management, in delivery of construction projects? You know, is it really well placed to take on that risk? There needs to be that sense of self-awareness and evaluation. And obviously, if it's looking to do a joint venture, you know, has it found a partner that it can work with to share risk in a way that it's confident that they're aligned in their purposes and principles? So, you know, that's not an easy answer. I would say it's sometimes a great answer, but my experience of going through a process of finding a joint venture partner, it takes time, and it can be, you know, quite a long and difficult negotiation. Even though it can deliver brilliantly in the long run, it's not a quick and easy solution. Whereas a development agreement where you sell land to somebody and then they take off the risk and deliver it can be much quicker, but you have less influence and control over the end product. So it's that weighing up, wanting to have control, which of course politically local authorities always want to have control and influence over things, but then do they want to take on the risk? If you talk to your local authority finance director, typically they would much rather pass the risk on to the private sector than hold it themselves. And you look at things like the Croydon Council situation last year, you know, you can see why local authorities have to be particularly careful about how much risk they take on. The housing company model, which is what I've done a lot of work on over the last 7 years, as you said, I mean, it's something that has become very popular as a model, but there are cases where it hasn't worked out, Croydon being the most high profile, but there are other cases where it hasn't delivered. So again, it's not an easy answer, and you need to think through very carefully why you're doing it.
Yeah, and just for our listeners, that Croydon one was related to their in-house development company called Brick by Brick.
That's right.
Which had lots of aspirations and really exciting. Unfortunately, didn't work out, and that is something that scares the sector a little bit. For new local authorities trying to progress. But there's plenty that are still doing it, and plenty that are doing it well. Another example of kind of a direct delivery vehicle in London is 60 Bricks, Waltham Forest, which are doing really well, and plenty of others I'm sure we could name. But just to summarise those four, so you're saying, kind of what I got from that was, you've got these four different options, and the difference between them are basically the risk and reward that you're willing to have, with direct delivery being the riskiest, where the actual council itself, the council as in its own entity, creates these delivers homes. Direct delivery, they have an arm's length where they might actually hire a whole team. Would you mind just giving a summary for the listeners in terms of what the four different options kind of entail, from, let's say, the riskiest down, so from direct delivery?
Yeah, you see, again, the other issue, as well as the riskiness, is what are you delivering? And so tailoring the approach to what you want to deliver is also part of it. So I'll try and answer your question about risk, but cover that point as well. So, for example, if all you want to build is affordable social housing, then actually that's relatively low risk, because you're not worried about sales and prices of homes in the marketplace and anything like that. If you know you've got a very large demand for housing, so most London boroughs have got a huge waiting list. They've got people in temporary accommodation who've been through the homeless duty. Building homes for those people is a no-brainer. You know, there's a ready demand for that product, and there's a strong argument for the council to own those homes and rent them to those people. So the risk there is limited to the risk of the construction process. So getting your planning permission, getting your contractor on site and building it. And of course, there's a lot of risk in there, particularly at the moment with the cost inflation in the construction industry, with labour shortages and issues with supply chain materials and so on. But if you can get a fixed price contract for a construction to be done, and you can manage that to completion and stick to your budget, then it pretty much is a surefire thing. It's not too risky. Whereas if you're doing a development which is a mix of social housing and market sale, which councils are getting into that, and certainly a lot of housing associations have been doing that for years, there's a lot more risk in that. And the bigger the scheme and the longer the delivery phasing of that scheme, particularly if it's something like a large estate regeneration scheme with several phases, then again, you get this compounded risk over time. So I would say you need to be clear what you want to deliver, what the product is, and some products are riskier than others. And then you look at the delivery mechanism and you work out how much risk you want to take on there as well. And that's where you get to the right solution. There is, I can't say there is always one solution, because sometimes, you have a couple of different choices you can make, and it's up to each council. Some councils would rather do it through a housing company than through the housing revenue account, even though both routes could work. And that will come down to some, local political issues or local kind of branding issues where they might want to do it one way or another, and the risk profile might be very similar.
Yeah. And question as well for you is it, there's also kind of a big political thing regarding land as well, and these four options really work most for councils that have land and access to it. If you don't have much available land for development, then you can't really do many of these options. But if you do, then you've got obviously the four different options, and some of them you get to retain the land, where others you'll dispose of it.
Yeah.
And as you know, politically over the last, I think, 10 years, it's become even a bigger issue than ever of retaining land to deliver affordable homes, because councils are feeling like they're selling land, and at the end of the day, the developers might just be building something which is open market, which is too expensive for the local residents. So would you also would you also agree that each of these four will have a complete kind of a different aspect in terms of how the council reacts to its own land bank? Because you either keep the risk, but keep your land, or get rid of the risk and start losing some of your land assets.
Sure. So, I mean, I think with development as a whole, there are three key factors. There's the land, there's the finance, and then there's the expertise to deliver the development. And so the direct delivery route within the council is where the council has all three of those. It's got the land, it's got the finance to deliver that, maybe with some government grant or its own borrowing, a combination of the two, and it's built up its own expertise to deliver. When you look at the housing company model, the council is effectively selling the land from the council into the housing company, and of course it's a subsidiary company, so the council still owns it, but it's transferred it into its company. The company will then have its own financial profile, which will normally be a loan from the council. It probably doesn't get the grant from the government, although you can set up an RP company to do that. But quite often it will bring in other sources of finance, and it will bring in its own expertise. So again, it's. I mean, I think you were referring to that earlier in terms of the team that actually deliver the scheme. They put it through planning, they project manage construction. Companies are a great way of bringing together an expert resource to do that outside of the normal local authority framework of employment. So they can employ on different terms, which can be very beneficial to getting good people in. And then obviously you've got the routes that go through a JV or selling the site, where the council is willing to pass that land over, or at least on some terms or another. So, for example, there are JV arrangements where the council holds onto the freehold of the land, but long leases the whole site to the JV. The JV builds out. The JV sells the market sale units on leases into the private sector, and then the social or affordable housing comes back to the local authority as the freeholder. So there's arrangements like that can work really well. So I mean that I'm starting to get into kind of complex arrangements, but those are the kinds of things that, as you work through each model, you work out, okay, where does the land need to sit in order to make this work in delivery terms, and where does the land need to sit for the long-term ownership and management. And you can have systems of leases and so on where it sits with one vehicle during the development process, and then it comes back to the local authority for the long term, or in part, it comes back in part. But yeah, I mean, sometimes the right thing to do is to sell the land wholesale over to the private sector or an RP, because the local authority just can't afford to take on the long-term management and all the costs involved in that. It's just not financed to do that. Whereas the private sector will come in, or the RP will come in with the funding to do that, and the long-term management will be delivered in a way that the local authority could never do.
Yeah, so and I think it's quite interesting how you've broken it down in terms of those three aspects: land, finance, and expertise. And I guess depending on which ones you have and which ones you don't, and how much you care about retaining the land, potentially you could, for example, do a JV where you're putting some elements in and the other party puts some elements in, but as you say, you can retain the land for the long term. Yeah, I mean,
typically with a JV, the council is bringing the land and the private partner is bringing the expertise, and then the financing, that's where it gets really interesting. Is it 50-50 equity input from both parties, or does the land count as the equity input from the council, and the JV partner then brings in all the development finance? And again, every scheme is different because it depends on the numbers involved. in terms of the whole issue around sales, then if you're doing a scheme that involves a lot of market sale, how do you share the profit? So is there a basic level of profit share within the JV that is then weighted in favour of the private sector partner if they can do better than that kind of minimum threshold, or is it weighted in favour of the local authority if they can bring in additional benefits? So again, it gets complicated as to how you structure each of those deals.
In a previous life, Mark, I was a JV supervisor on lots of projects. So it gets into a lot more detail and exactly what you're saying, which with tranche payments depending on how much revenue is generated. But yeah, that's really interesting. I thought it'd be great to for the 4 different categories to try and give a few examples of councils that that are doing that might be doing each of the different ones. Direct delivery. Do you know which councils would you say are kind of leaders in doing it in-house?
Sure. So I mean, what's really interesting is that some councils are doing all of them, and so that as I say, almost on a site-by-site basis, you decide which is the right route for each site. A good example of direct delivery would be Hackney Council, who they I think decided quite early on that they had the capacity and would build up the capacity to deliver in-house pretty much everything. So they've done estate regeneration, they've done new build infill within their housing revenue account. They have set up a housing company, but really it's just as a residual thing, so that where they haven't been selling all of their market sale units, some of them they've sold into a company that then does PRS, rents them out privately. It's a kind of fallback position where they can't sell stuff. And I did quite a bit of work with them advising on that strategy. But yeah, they've delivered huge numbers and they've got a big in-house team. Whereas if I contrast that with somewhere like Kingston, so I did some work with Kingston, and so in Kingston there's a big estate regen scheme called Cambridge Road, which is a joint venture approach, and that's with Countryside Properties, which is now part of the Vistry Group. And so that's one where, as far as I understand it, the council will retain the freehold and will retain the affordable housing, but all of the market sale on leasehold will be handled by Countryside. And the council has a small additional programme of new build direct delivery in the housing revenue account. So yeah, they're doing a bit of both, really.
Sorry, Mark. When you say in the housing revenue account, do you mean is that essentially doing direct delivery? It's within the council.
So this is some of the jargon, isn't it? So the housing revenue account is a ring-fenced local government account for managing all the rent that comes in from council housing and all the expenditure that goes out on council housing. And when you build new council housing as a local authority, you pretty much always do it through your housing revenue account, unless you decide to set up a company. And people who set up companies to build affordable housing, they sometimes call it council housing, but it's not housing revenue account. It's not HRA council housing. So from the government perspective, and from a legal perspective, it's more like private housing than council housing, even though the council ultimately owns it. So a bit complex, that. But yeah, so when I talk about in the HRA, in the housing revenue account, it's direct delivery by the council. But they may well be using a partner to actually do the development. So again, I think in Kingston, there's a couple of schemes that Countryside are building as part of that relationship for the council, even though they will end up being council housing, and there may not be any market sale on those sites. But that's just part of the relationship they've built up around that wider delivery programme.
Yeah, because a similar council is Cambridge City Council. They're quite renowned. They've got the Cambridge Investment Partnership, which is a partnership between them and Hill. where they're working on loads of projects on kind of a joint venture basis across the borough, which is kind of a prominent example of that model.
Yeah. Another interesting example would be Haringey, who I did some work with. So Haringey were quite interested in the idea of setting up a housing company to deliver new affordable housing, and that was in the days prior to the lifting of the borrowing cap on the housing revenue account. So it used to be that the government prevented councils borrowing over a certain level. So I think they actually made a decision that they would set up a company, and then a few months later the government lifted the borrowing cap, and so they reversed that decision and decided to deliver within the council's housing revenue account. So their direct delivery team is now delivering significant numbers of new council homes within the HRA.
Yeah, excellent. And with the final one of your 4 criteria, the disposal, what's your view on this? What's the best way to do that? Because I've seen there's the GLA, so in London, the Greater London Authority has the Small Sites, Small Builders programme, which essentially supports councils to dispose of sites specifically for selling it to smaller, medium-sized developers to help them get access to land, and for them to some of them have criteria associated to them, so you have to deliver so much affordable housing and whatever it might need to be. But yeah, have you had experience of working with them?
Yeah, I have, and I mean, I think the disposal route, as I said, using a development agreement approach is a way of the local authority having a degree of influence and control over what gets built, even though the council may not have any long-term interest in terms of ownership and may not be funding it at all. But in order to make sure that what gets built is in line with the council's strategic aims, beyond just a planning approval, then that kind of development agreement can be really effective. But equally, that's a lot of work, and it does cost money to go through that process. So you'd normally only do that on a larger scheme. On the smaller sites, I think putting it out through the GLA framework or the council's own process is much better. And ultimately, it's like how much does the local authority need to quickly make some money? And that, that's just a reality that councils sometimes are in that position. They do need some capital receipts, but also how much do they trust the market, the development market, to deliver something suitable, something that works in that location. So if it's a pretty straightforward development site in an area where you can be confident that what's going to be delivered fits pretty well and that the planning process is going to deliver a good scheme, then putting it out as a unconditional sale even can be very effective. Whereas if you've got a larger scheme in a particularly sensitive location, that's where I think the politics of it and the kind of place shaping, place making aspect of it dictates that a development agreement is the way to go. So for example, a few years ago in Greenwich, I was involved in the Woolwich 3 estates, where there were three estates in the central Woolwich. It was over 1,000 homes, so it's pretty large scale. And so we went through a competitive dialogue process where we had regular meetings with the contractors who were interested in taking that on, to make sure that what was being delivered fitted with the council's strategic ambitions for those sites, even though we weren't going to be owning what was built or paying for what was being developed, but we wanted to have that level of influence. And I would say that was definitely the right way to go in that scenario.
Yeah, I think that's a really, really good tips on kind of the view for councils to look at during disposal. It's if you feel like it needs that guidance, provide it. If you feel like it doesn't need the guidance, then you can dispose of it unconditionally, depending on the situation.
I think the other thing that's worth saying about the smaller sites is that there's a real opportunity there to work with the non-traditional developers. So whether that's the small, medium enterprise developers, self-builders, custom builders, and so on, community-led housing development, which is something, again, in London, the GLA have been promoting this very positively. And you referred to when I was at Tower Hamlets. So Tower Hamlets have done a lot of work on working with self-builders, custom builders, community-led builders. And again, it takes a bit of extra time and effort to put the energy in up front. But once you've got a good policy on that, it can enable all kinds of developments that wouldn't have happened otherwise. So I think that's really something that authorities should be looking at.
The sites that are maybe too small or too tricky to fit in with the large house builders' business models, essentially.
Yeah, and also they're ones that the local authority would probably find not risky, but just time-consuming and costly. So councils will tend to want to focus on the medium and larger sites just to get the economies of scale, whereas your self-builder or community builder is at the opposite end. They want to focus on the smaller sites to deliver that bespoke product that they're looking to achieve.
Yeah, and then on the other side of the coin, so we're talking about disposable and JVs, but the other side of the coin is private sector are always very interested to try and get involved with public sector companies and work together, JV or buy sites or whatever it might be. What's your advice for private sector companies? Because we always get them speaking to us about this. What's your advice to them to try and get involved with local authorities to try and help them meet their aspirations?
Yeah, I mean, obviously the starting point is to understand what the local authorities' drivers are, what their purposes are. So if you know that a local authority has a particular issue with homelessness or the need to house larger families, or is particularly bothered about the local private rented sector and wanting to improve standards, and it's working out what the local authorities' primary aims are and coming alongside to meet those aims. Because if a private developer comes along and they've got a fixed view, we only want to do build to rent, or we only want to do lots of studio flats, or whatever it is, that's going to be a much harder conversation, I think. So like any partnership, it's about understanding the other party and meeting them where their needs need to be met, where their ambitions and drives are. So that's the first thing to say. I think the other thing is just that the way public sector procurement works is convoluted, and it's tricky for some people to understand. So again, working out where you sit in relation to that procurement process, being open to having that experience and learning from it, rather than getting frustrated with it, because some of those processes do take time, and there's various governance processes, levels of control that have to be gone through. But I mean, a good public sector partner will know how to explain that and bring you on board with that process. But sometimes, as I said earlier, sometimes a JV takes a long time to put together, and that procurement process to find a partner, it can be time consuming, it can be costly, but it can really be worth it in the end. Yeah,
excellent. We have kind of a final question on this kind of section regarding the different delivery options, delivery vehicles, and etc. Is for those 4 different criterias, as you kind of alluded to earlier, what you stated earlier was that one council might do many of these, and it depends on their portfolio and their sites. How does that process work? So let's say you've got lots of sites and a big land portfolio, and then you need to kind of assess which ones might fit for different types of for each one of these different four routes.
Yeah, and it's a great question. I mean, what I would say is there's a way it ideally works, and then there's a way it often works, and they're different. Ideally, you have a really transparent process internally within the council and any organisation you've set up, like a housing company, so that every site that becomes available is appraised, evaluated, and then the route it's going to take to direct delivery or housing company or JV or sale is understood and agreed by everyone working in the development process within that authority. And to me, it's like having a clearinghouse. So you get everybody around the table and you look at the opportunity and you go through exactly the appraisal we've just been talking about, looking at all those different factors, and then you evaluate it. You say, this is the best delivery option, and you agree that. You might even have those kinds of appraisals going to a cabinet meeting of the politicians, or certainly within the council, some kind of senior management sign-off process. So that's the ideal. A lot of places, there is an early feasibility or appraisal of a site. Someone says, well, we think it should be used for this delivery route, and it kind of gets branded as direct delivery or housing company or whatever, and it hasn't been through that kind of transparent process. And people think they own the site for that particular output before it's really been properly considered. And I mean, you can get that kind of turf war or whatever you want to call it, territorial rights thing going on between different players within the same authority, and that's obviously not a great way to go. What I've always said is, even though you might have several different delivery approaches, you need a unified, integrated delivery team. You need clear lines of responsibility and people working together. And I've seen that work really well. So you can have the same team of project managers. One day they're working on a project which is going through the HRA direct delivery route. The next day they're working on a project that's going out to the housing company or out for sale. But they're applying the same expertise and rigor to all of those. And it's it's well understood that everybody works as one team. That's the ideal.
Yeah, I've seen a lot of times where I speak to clients and they talk to me about their portfolio, and I ask them, how did you decide on that delivery program on those sites? And sometimes they look at me a little bit bewildered. They haven't actually gone through that thorough process. Someone's just said, these are the sites that we're going to do direct delivery with, or whatever it might be. But yeah, that's a really, really interesting point.
And sometimes I think you have to be willing to switch from one route to another halfway through the process, and having that flexibility and understanding built in to all your systems and all your conversations is really important. So you might have a site that you've taken through to planning and you've got your planning consent, but because of some change in funding, because of some change in how you're going to want to own this in the long term, you then switch it over to another delivery route. That can still work. The product shouldn't define the delivery route entirely. There'll be an influence, of course, but you need to be able to flex. And of course, you can flex tenures sometimes. So you might have something that was designed as market sale, and at some point you might decide you're going to run it as PRS, and therefore it goes to a different delivery route because of the funding and the ownership that you want to bring around. I think
that's why it's so important to have that portfolio view, because you might actually decide that this one we might do 100% affordable because the viability of that one is supporting this, and you actually have a bigger view where the viability is wider than just one site.
Exactly.
Cool. Well, look, that was so many insights in a very short period of time, and I know that we could have both gone into a lot more detail there. And just on this, the final section that we like to go into on the podcast is asking all of our kind of experts that come on our podcast to give us kind of one example of a scheme where they've had, let's say, an abortive cost has come in. So basically something where money was spent on a scheme where, with hindsight, we could have saved lots of money. It happens all the time. And that's essentially what the podcast is all about, is how to give people the insights at the early stages to make sure their projects run smoothly without losing money on things they shouldn't be. So question to you, Mark. A time where on a project of yours, whichever it might be, where you've had kind of abortive costs come in.
Sure. I mean, the best example, I'm not going to name names, but there was a local authority housing company, and the issue with this particular scheme was that it was taken all the way through design, feasibility, planning process, and at the last minute in the planning process, there was community consultation, community objections from local residents, and the politicians who, they owned this company, but the company was obviously run by a separate board and separate staff. The politicians, in effect, instructed the company to pull the scheme and take it right back to the design stage and redesign it and put it back into planning with a reduced scope of scheme that would, they hoped, deal with the community objections. And clearly that cost a lot of money because you've got all those abortive costs of the architects, design team, planning consultants, and the planning application.
What stage did it get to in terms of design?
Oh, I mean, it was all the way through to the planning stage.
Yeah, wow.
So, it effectively was withdrawn before the planning was given on it, but, right at the last minute.
Yeah.
And, I mean, clearly the way forward there in terms of a lesson learned is that from the housing company point of view, engaging the politicians right up front when you're at the early feasibility stage and saying to them, this is the scheme that this company that you've set up wants to deliver. We need your endorsement, we need your backing, that you're going to support this all the way through the planning process. If you've got any concerns about how this might land with the local community, with whether you're willing to back it through that process, we need to know up front. And getting that buy-in early on is critical. And I think that lesson learned, it's not that you want the local authority company to have no independence, because it needs to have flexibility and independence to act, but it always has to recognise it's owned by the authority, which is essentially the politicians making those long-term decisions. So
and these politicians are the ward councillors, is that, and the borough mayor, is that who we're talking about? I
mean, most councils now are run by a cabinet and a leader. So there's a leader of the council and about 10 councillors who are making the key executive decisions. And of course, they're influenced by the local ward councillors as well. And sometimes the local ward councillors are the cabinet members or even the leader of the council in any particular case. But yeah, essentially the people who are going to have that level of influence are going to be the cabinet members or the leader of the council typically.
Yeah, and do you have a number? Do you know how much potentially was spent there, which had to be spent again? Or
I'm going to guess we're talking £250,000, something like that. I mean, it wouldn't have been cheap to do all the design work and get it through to planning.
Yeah.
So it's a big enough number. And, and where you've set up a housing company, you're not insulated or insured against that risk. It's all sitting in that company. So if the company's only just started out and it's only just beginning to make money, that's quite a hit on your bottom line. Yeah.
And it's crazy that I'm trying to kind of raise awareness of abortive costs. I feel like people in the industry don't really talk about it. It's like, that's normal, we need to redesign that now.
Yeah.
Or we didn't do that, so
I think a lot of local housing companies, when they start out, they put together a business plan which assumes that everything that they've got in their pipeline is going to be delivered, and they don't build in this kind of contingency. They don't think, okay, well, actually, if we've got 10 sites, chances are one or two of them won't make it through to planning. So we need to build in those abortive costs. A private developer knows that's the situation, and if they're lucky, there's no abortive costs, but most of the time there is.
Yeah.
And they build it into their profit margin. And I don't think local authority companies have started out with that mindset, again, because of inexperience.
Yeah. And just a question there is, how many units was that scheme?
I can't remember the number of units. Sorry,
okay. That's okay. It's always helpful to kind of tie it in with the abortive cost. It's quite interesting statistics. But look, it's been an excellent session, Mark, and thank you so much for sharing all your insights. We've talked all the different strategies for how to take schemes forwards from a public sector entity, direct delivery, joint venture, in-house company, or even disposal. A few examples of all of those, and kind of the abortive costs that can come up in the industry, which comes up really, really often, which is something that we're working to kind of reduce and mitigate. But that's been an excellent session, and what we'll do is, if any of our listeners want to get in touch with Mark, his details will be in the comments, so feel free to dive in and send him a message if you'd like to get in touch with him. And Mark, is there anything else you want to add?
Just to say that although I'm no longer a consultant and I'm working with Redbridge Council, I'm always happy to take a call or have an email from somebody and share my experience. So do get in touch. Yeah,
amazing. Well, look, thank you so much for your time, and we'll be in touch soon. So thank you very much, and speak shortly.
Cheers. Thank you. Bye bye.